Hello, good evening. This is Dylan from Dylan Pickups with this week's Dylan Talks Tone podcast. The podcast that we talk about everything guitar tone from the pick all the way to the speaker in your amp and the air in the room. We talk about everything having to do with guitar tone, and I think we're going to have some pretty cool stuff this evening. This is really fun because over the last few weeks of doing this, I think this is our fourth one. It's gotten really user driven. So I don't even have to think of anything to talk about because you all have been listening, providing us, asking us questions, and then we go ahead and talk about those questions on the next episode. So one of the things we want to talk about this week, we're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about treble bleeds, and we're going to talk about whining a guitar pickup, okay? Because there are some terms that happen all the time with scatterwinding is the main one that people talk about all the time. So we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But let's talk about this treble bleed thing first. So treble bleeds are an interesting thing, and it's one of those quote-unquote upgrades that people always talk about getting. Oh, I want to do this. I want to put a treble bleed on my guitar. Well, first of all, we need to understand what they do and why we think we might need them, okay? And what they are supposed to do, and some causes and effects, and some gives and takes of having them. Okay, so, and again, if you're watching this live on Facebook or on Periscope, just leave questions and we'll chat about them afterwards. Treble bleeds. The nature of a volume and tone circuit in a guitar, because of the impedance, not the resistance, but the impedance of the pickups, and then cables and wiring and et cetera, and actually basically the way a voltage divider works, which is what your volume knob really is. What it means is that as you lower the volume, you end up with sort of a low-pass filter concept happening, and it has to do with the raising of the resistance as the volume pot gets lowered. So as you turn the volume down on the guitar, the long and the short of it is the low frequencies start to go away, because as that resistance rises, the first frequencies to go away, and it is kind of a progressive thing as you turn the volume down on the guitar from 10, which is basically like a direct short on your volume knob, all the way down. Basically, the bottom line is that you end up in the way of volume pot works, because it's on one side, then on the other. Anyway, the long and the short of it is, as the volume falls, high frequencies start to get filtered out of that circuit. Now, this, in many people's eyes, is a very negative thing, because what happens is that, you know, your intended tone that you have set is all nice and bright, and it's very clear, and you have a lot of clarity, and everything sounds great, good note definition. And then as you turn your volume down, you start to lose that. It gets a little bit muddy. Okay, and so the way people like to solve this a lot of times is, because you're losing, quote unquote, losing tone as you turn your volume down, is they like to put a treble bleed on it. And what that typically is basically adding more or less a high pass filter. Okay, and what it does is you put it across two of the legs on the volume pot, and it basically it takes a capacitor and many times a resistor, and we'll talk about the reasons for both. First of all, it takes a capacitor, it puts it across those two volume pot legs, and it allows some of the high frequencies to kind of bypass the volume pot. So no matter where the volume pot is, there are still high frequencies getting through, and it is allowing you to, quote unquote, retain that clarity. Okay? And so then what happens is, and then you add a resistor into this so that it kind of stays even. Because if you just do a capacitor by itself, many times what will happen is, as you turn the volume down, the instead of it getting kind of muddier and duller, it'll get brighter and brighter and brighter because it kind of like flips the effect of turning the volume down. Okay. So you put a resistor in there that will change, what's the easiest way to say it? It basically changes the way the taper on the pot interacts, and it makes it to where how do I say it? I guess it basically makes it to where it stays there, but it doesn't pull it all the way out. So and there's a formula for this I could actually share with you. If we should shoot a video on this so I can actually show you also. The problem is, and so here's the problem with using a treble bleed, and you can use one. It's totally fine. And what will end up happening is you'll end up having higher frequencies, as even those higher frequencies will not go away as the volume gets turned down on the guitar. Okay, those higher frequencies will stay there. And in fact, depending on the value of capacitor that you use and the value of resistor that you use, either in parallel or in series, there's a few different ways to do it. You'll actually have more highs than when you started. Okay, so that is one thing you have to think about. The other thing is, putting that resistor across those two legs changes the overall resistance of the potentiometer in the first place, the effective resistance between those two components. What this means is that it changes, depending on the value of the resistor, it changes the taper of the pot. Now, this is a huge deal, especially if you use, well, either way, if you use a linear taper pot or an audio taper pot, it's going to change how the volume comes down. It's not only going to change how the volume comes down, but it's also going to change, again, that high pass, low pass filter effect. Okay? So what you've done now is you've basically introduced more variables into your circuit. Okay? The thing about using a treble bleed on a guitar is that when we talk about guitar circuits in general, and we're talking about passive circuits, we're talking about a passive circuit, and we're talking about one with no battery. We're not talking about like a active pickup setup, but your normal passive guitar circuit. Every component that you put in there, okay, is going to take away signal. Okay? You cannot, without a battery and a preamp, put signal back in. Okay? So when you put a capacitor across your volume pot, you are stripping away signal and leaving high frequencies when the volume comes down. To tame those overly high frequencies that you have created, you add that resistor, further stripping high frequencies, since you've stripped the low ones out already, away from your signal. Now, granted, this is variable in reverse proportion to where the volume knob is, but still, you are stripping away frequencies from your signal. And a lot of people will say, well, if the volume knob is at 10, then it's a direct short, and all of this stuff is mute, because at 10, then that should have no effect. However, no volume pot, I'm not going to say no volume pot, but I'm going to say the majority of volume pots, and I actually took a handful out and tested them today before I said this out loud on the internet. The majority of volume pots that you have are not going to be 100% all the way on 10. It's just the way they're made, that there is still going to be signal passing. So, to a trained ear, depending on the resistor you use and the capacitor that you use, the guitar will not sound the same as it will without a treble bleed on it. because you have to remember this. This is a super key point when you're putting any component in the guitar. When you add components such as a filter circuit, the capacitor takes out low frequencies as the volume goes down. Then, to compensate for having only high frequencies left and it sounding very harsh, you add a resistor and you take further frequencies out. What this means is that the money that you spent on your pickups is now doesn't sound the same. And if you leave your volume on 10 all the time, then it's a possibility that you'll get away with hearing a very small, if not at all difference, if it's on 10 all the time. But the point of putting a treble bleed circuit in your guitar is so that you can use your volume knob. So as you start to use your volume knob, you will actually be stripping away original signal that you had from the pickups that you spent all that money for. And so as you can tell, and I'm just full disclosure, I'm not a fan of treble bleeds. I believe that they are a Band-Aid of a Band-Aid. Because, and a lot of people like them, and you can use it in your guitar, and that's totally fine. And if it gets you the sound that you want, that's totally great. And go for it. The reason I don't personally like them is because they take away from the dynamics of the pickup. So what I mean by that is you put these components in there, and as you turn the volume down, the pickup just kind of sounds that same sound from 10 to 1. Well, and you're like, well, that's kind of the goal of the thing. However, when we're talking about using pick attack to vary how much, how dynamic our playing is, we're using a very dynamic pickup to help us go from clean to dirty with just the volume knob. We're using the clarity of the pickup at 10 and then rolling it back to 5 to sweeten it up to have, some nice rhythm tones. Those dynamics get flattened a lot when you put a treble bleed in your guitar. So it sterilizes the signal a little bit because you're stripping signal away to accomplish this. In my opinion, and of course this is just my opinion, but a much better way to do it is to have a really good dynamic pickup, make the proper cap and pot choices so that you have that flexibility within the guitar, and you make that whole frequency change with the volume knob part of your tone as you use it, because you really start to understand the change that you can make and actually use it as a part. So when we start to talk about using pick attack to send the guitar into overdrive, and as we start to talk about different overdrive pedals that accentuate various frequencies or mid-range humps or various things like this, you start to put these signal stripping circuits in your guitar, and you start to sterilize that a little bit, and you don't have those dynamics as much. So that just gives you an idea. The capacitor strips away the low frequencies, leaving the high ones as it bypasses on the volume knob. That's what it does. And then the resistor takes away, it attenuates, if you will, the high frequencies so they're not so harsh. But again, every time you attenuate something, you're basically stripping away signal. So that's my take on treble bleeds. They, again, with the right guitar, and the thing is if you're searching for a particular type of tone and a treble bleed gets you there, by all means use it. And many guys that say, well, I use this guitar and I use it on the neck pickup. I have a friend actually that plays in a band, and he plays a Les Paul through a Friedman, and he has treble bleeds on his guitar, and he basically uses kind of two tones from his neck pickup. One's a real heavy tone, and one is almost like an acoustic guitar sounding tone when it's coil split. And he can accomplish that with a treble bleed because of the way it has stripped those frequencies away. It really almost kind of does sound like an acoustic guitar, very clean when it's coil split on the neck pickup at like 5 or 4, and then he turns it up to 10 and it gets a completely different tone because it's super heavy. So that's kind of an extreme thing, though. The dynamics are not as subtle with that circuit in there. He actually really only needs 2 different tones. He gets them, and that's how it works. But so if it works for you, it works for you. But again, it's not as dynamic, in my opinion, as just doing it super plain. But I like to keep it simple with that stuff anyway. So the other thing we want to talk about tonight, before we go to our, let's see, what are we going to talk about? Scatterwinding. Okay, so this is one of those buzzwords that we hear on the internet all the time, and it's funny because I get clients call and customers call, and one of the very first things they'll ask me, because we make our pickups by hand, is, do you scatterwind your pickups? If you go to the Dylan Talks Tone episodes on YouTube, you will see episode 1 discusses how we at Dylan Pickups make pickups. Okay. And that is going to give you a really good idea of how we build them. And so this term scatterwinding, the way I like to liken it is anytime you put string or cable or anything on a spool. So string on a bobbin for a sewing machine. I like to use a winch is a great example. When you put the cable back on a winch and you put it on there really, really nice and it looks perfectly neat, okay? That's the way a machine wound pickup typically is made. It is a pre-programmed deal, and the wire is wound one wrap right next to the other, and it's usually a predetermined number of wraps per layer. So for instance, on a Telecaster or a Stratocaster pickup, it may be somewhere between 200 and 250 wraps per layer, and then it starts to go back the other way. They call that the traverse, from side to side as it goes back and forth, okay? Very, very controlled. And that's how, like, I used to have a truck with a winch on it, and if I got really messy, the cable wouldn't even fit on there. It would just be all jumbled up, and it wouldn't even fit. It wouldn't work. That's because I, for lack of a better word, scatterwound my winch cable. So what scatterwinding is anytime you make a pass or a few wraps on that coil on the pickup without making it perfectly in line with one wire laying next to the other. And you say, well, why would you even do that on purpose? Well, number one, if you're doing it by hand, you're probably doing it not on purpose anyway. Now, I can lay a pretty nice, neat coil, but if you were to go down to the microscopic level, it would probably be a little messier than a machine, just because I'm doing it by hand. The other reason why you would do this, and you would actually select to do it, in fact, there are many machines that nowadays can be programmed to do it, is because there is a thing called capacitive loss. And what this means is that every time you have 2 wires laying next to each other with electricity going through them, and audio signal is a better example. So if you have 2 wires laying next to each other with audio signal going through it, that voltage that becomes audio signal, because of various constructions of the wire and the insulation and how it's laid in there, those 2 wires that lay next to each other over a long period of time have a tendency to lose signal to each other, okay? So what this usually, it's called capacitive loss, and what it usually manifests itself is treble loss, loss of clarity. Same exact thing that we just talked about a few minutes ago. Another example of capacitive loss over a long cable run is 25, 30-foot guitar cables, okay? That's because you have a wire laying next to another one for a long stretch, and you're starting to lose signal one to the other, and it's called capacitive loss. So the way we can combat that is we can scramble it up a little bit, make it not 100% neat, so they're not totally laying next to each other the whole time. So it might be nice and neat for a little while, and then it'll be a little messy just for a second, and then it'll be nice and neat again. But it breaks it up just enough so that there is not that so much capacitive loss. And what you end up with in the end is a clearer, more dynamic pickup. And the rate at which you do that is up to each pickup winder. I always say that if there was 3 pickup winders sitting down at 3 identical machines making the identical pickup with the identical materials, they'd probably all 3 sound different because we would put them onto the bobbin at a different rate of scatter, and it would all just be in our hands. So that's really what scatterwinding is. It's not really a do you do it or do you not do it. It's a matter of really are you doing this by hand or are you not? So yeah, that's really that. So I hope you found this helpful. Please leave us some comments. Leave us some anything in the video on the YouTube that when we upload it to YouTube. If you watch it on iTunes, please leave us a note. We'd like to hear from you. I want to know what you want us to talk about next week. Again, this is Dylan with Dylan Pickups, and this is Dylan Talks Tone. Thank you very much, and we will see you next week.